In the harsh winter of 1847, along the windswept plains of New Mexico Territory, a half-dead cowboy named Jack Morrison stumbled upon something that would change his life forever. What started as a simple act of kindness toward a starving Navajo widow would spiral into a deadly game of honor, betrayal, and revenge that would shake the very foundations of two worlds. But the woman he saved wasn't who she claimed to be, and the marriage pact that followed would reveal secrets buried deeper than any grave in the desert sand. The snow fell thick and unforgiving across the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as Jack Morrison rode his weary horse through the treacherous passes of northern New Mexico. His weathered face bore the scars of countless storms, both natural and man-made, and his empty stomach growled louder than the wind that cut through his torn coat. 3 days without food, 2 without water, and now this blizzard threatened to claim what little life remained in his bones. Jack had been running from something or someone, though he'd never admit it to himself. The failed cattle drive in Colorado, the poker game gone wrong in Santa Fe, the woman who'd sworn vengeance after he'd refused her father's business proposition. All of it seemed like another lifetime as he struggled to stay conscious in the saddle. Through the swirling white curtain of snow, a thin column of smoke caught his attention. Smoke meant fire, fire meant shelter, and shelter might mean survival. Without hesitation, Jack guided his horse toward the source, his frozen fingers barely able to grip the reins. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his days. A small adobe hut, barely more than a shelter, sat nestled against a cluster of pine trees. The smoke rose weakly from a hole in the roof, suggesting whoever lived there had little fuel left to burn. Jack dismounted and approached the crude wooden door, his boots crunching through snow that reached his knees. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a sight that stopped his heart cold. A Navajo woman, her dark eyes sunken with hunger and exhaustion, stared up at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She couldn't have been more than 25, but suffering had aged her beyond her years. Her traditional dress hung loose on her thin frame, and Jack could see the outline of her ribs beneath the fabric. Behind her, huddled in the corner of the one-room dwelling, 3 small children watched with wide, frightened eyes. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8, the youngest barely walking. Their faces told the same story of starvation and desperation that marked their mother's features. But this wasn't just any starving family Jack had discovered. Hidden beneath layers of deception and carefully constructed lies lay a truth so explosive it would ignite a war between the Navajo Nation and the U.S. Army. The woman's real identity, the reason she was alone with these children, and the mysterious disappearance of her husband were all connected to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government. And Jack Morrison, the broken-down cowboy who thought he was simply saving a widow and her children, was about to become the unwitting pawn in a game of power and revenge that would test every moral fiber of his being. The woman spoke no English, but hunger and desperation needed no translation. She gestured to the children, then to her own hollow cheeks, mimicking the act of eating. Jack understood immediately. These people were dying slowly and painfully from starvation. The harsh winter had trapped them in this isolated location, far from any trading post or settlement. Whatever food they'd had was long gone, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Without immediate help, none of them would see another week. Jack's own supplies were meager, barely enough to keep himself alive for another day or two. But looking into those desperate eyes, he knew he had no choice. He returned to his horse and retrieved his saddlebags, pulling out the last of his jerky, a small bag of cornmeal, and a precious tin of beans he'd been saving for his own survival. The woman's eyes filled with tears as he handed over the food, and she immediately began preparing a thin soup over the dying fire. The children gathered around the pot like moths to a flame, their small hands reaching toward the warmth and the promise of their first meal in days. As the family ate, Jack studied the woman more carefully. Something about her seemed different from the other Navajo he'd encountered in his travels through the territory. Her clothing, while worn and dirty, showed signs of intricate beadwork and fine craftsmanship that suggested wealth or high status. The silver and turquoise jewelry she wore, though tarnished, was of exceptional quality. Most telling were her hands, soft despite the hardships, with long, graceful fingers that spoke of a life spent in comfort rather than manual labor. This woman had fallen far from whatever heights she'd once occupied, and Jack found himself wondering what tragedy had brought her to this desperate state. The storm raged for 3 more days, trapping Jack with the family in their tiny shelter. During this time, he shared what little food he had, supplementing their meager supplies by hunting small game when the weather permitted. He learned that the woman's name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue. The children were her son and 2 daughters, though she seemed reluctant to speak of their father or explain how they'd come to be alone in such a remote location. There was fear in her eyes whenever Jack asked about their circumstances, a terror that went beyond simple hunger and cold. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a landscape transformed by snow and ice. The world outside their shelter gleamed white and pristine, beautiful but deadly to anyone unprepared for its harshness. Jack knew he should leave, continue his journey south toward warmer territory and the possibility of work. His supplies were exhausted, and staying longer would mean certain death for all of them. But something held him back, a nagging sense that abandoning this family now would be tantamount to murder. He'd seen too much death in his 34 years, had caused his share of it during the war and in the violent years that followed. The thought of adding 4 more souls to that tally sickened him. Instead of leaving, Jack made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He would take Ayana and her children to the nearest settlement, a trading post called Esperanza about 50 miles south. It was a dangerous journey through hostile territory, made even more treacherous by the winter conditions, but it was their only hope for survival. Ayana seemed to understand his intention without words, and her gratitude was evident in every gesture. She gathered their few possessions while Jack prepared his horse for the added burden of carrying 2 small children. The journey to Esperanza took 6 grueling days. Jack walked alongside his horse, giving up his place in the saddle to the children and their mother. His boots, already worn thin, began to fall apart on the 2nd day, forcing him to wrap his feet in strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. The cold penetrated to his bones, and more than once he wondered if he'd condemned them all to a slower death than the one they'd escaped. But Ayana proved stronger than her appearance suggested, walking beside him for hours without complaint, carrying her youngest daughter when the child could no longer ride. On the evening of the 5th day, they encountered something that chilled Jack's blood more than the winter wind. Tracks in the snow, made by unshod ponies and moccasined feet. A war party had passed this way recently, heading in the same direction they were traveling. Jack recognized the signs, having served as a scout during the Indian Wars. This wasn't a hunting party or a peaceful travel group. The tracks spoke of urgency, of men riding hard with a specific purpose in mind. When he showed them to Ayana, her face went pale, and she spoke rapidly in her own language, words that sounded like prayers or curses. That night, as they huddled around a small fire hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, Ayana finally revealed the truth that would explain everything. Through a mixture of broken English, gestures, and drawings in the dirt, she told Jack a story that made his blood run cold. She wasn't just any Navajo woman. She was the daughter of Chief Manolito, one of the most powerful and feared leaders in the territory. Her husband hadn't died of disease or accident as Jack had assumed. He'd been murdered, shot down in cold blood by soldiers from Fort Defiance while under a flag of truce. The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. If Ayana was Chief Manolito's daughter, then she was a prize beyond measure, a political tool that could be used to prevent war or provoke it, depending on who held her. Her presence in that isolated hut wasn't an accident or the result of being lost in a storm. Someone had hidden her there, keeping her away from both her own people and the authorities who would use her as leverage in their ongoing conflicts with the Navajo Nation. But who had hidden her and why? And what had happened to the person or persons responsible for her safety? The tracks they'd seen earlier suddenly took on new significance. If Chief Manolito had discovered his daughter's location, he would come for her with overwhelming force. The war party Jack had detected was likely the advance guard of a much larger group. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the pattern. The tracks showed signs of pursuit, as if the warriors were chasing something or someone rather than simply traveling toward a destination. Jack's military experience told him that meant trouble, the kind of trouble that could get innocent people killed. As dawn broke on their 6th day of travel, Jack spotted the buildings of Esperanza in the distance. The trading post sat at the confluence of 2 small rivers, its adobe walls and wooden stockade offering the promise of safety and civilization. But as they drew closer, Jack noticed something wrong. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no people moved in the streets, and most telling of all, the main gate stood wide open when it should have been securely closed against the winter cold. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip as he motioned for Ayanna and the children to stay back. The trading post was deserted, but not abandoned. Fresh horse tracks surrounded the buildings, and the snow was stained with dark patches that Jack recognized as blood. Inside the main building, overturned furniture and scattered goods told the story of a violent struggle. But there were no bodies, no signs of the inhabitants who should have been manning this remote outpost. It was as if an entire community had simply vanished into the winter air, leaving behind only evidence of violence and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Jack was examining the scene when he heard horses approaching from the north. Multiple riders, moving fast and making no attempt at stealth. He grabbed his rifle and positioned himself at one of the windows, motioning for Ayanna to hide with her children in the storage room behind the counter. Through the frost-covered glass, he watched as a dozen mounted men rode into the trading post's courtyard. But these weren't the Navajo warriors he'd expected to see. These were white men, dressed in a mixture of military and civilian clothing, heavily armed and bearing the hard faces of professional killers. The leader of the group dismounted and approached the main building with the confidence of a man who owned whatever ground he walked on. Jack recognized the type, a military officer turned mercenary, probably a veteran of the Mexican War who'd stayed in the territory to profit from its ongoing violence and instability. The man's uniform bore the insignia of a major, but Jack doubted he still held any legitimate commission. His companions looked like the kind of men who would do anything for money, the dregs of frontier society who'd found purpose in other people's conflicts. Major Clayton Reeves, as Jack would later learn the man's name, entered the trading post with his hand resting on his sidearm. His pale blue eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, taking in every detail of the scene. When he spoke, his voice carried the clipped accent of an educated Easterner, but there was something cold and calculating beneath the civilized veneer. He announced that he was searching for a Navajo woman and 3 children who'd escaped from protective custody at Fort Defiance. The woman was wanted for questioning in connection with recent attacks on supply convoys, and anyone harboring her would be considered an enemy of the territorial government. Jack remained hidden, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. The story Reeves told didn't match what Ayanna had revealed about her circumstances, but Jack was beginning to understand that truth was a rare commodity in this conflict-torn territory. Someone was lying, but determining who and why could mean the difference between life and death for everyone involved. He watched as Reeves and his men searched the other buildings, their movements systematic and thorough. These weren't casual bounty hunters or opportunistic soldiers. They were professionals with a specific mission, and they wouldn't give up easily. After an hour of searching, Reeves gathered his men in the courtyard and spoke in low tones that Jack couldn't make out through the window. The discussion seemed heated, with several of the men pointing in different directions and gesturing toward the horizon. Finally, Reeves mounted his horse and addressed his companions in a voice loud enough for Jack to hear. They would split into 2 groups, he announced. Half would continue south toward the Mexican border, while the others would backtrack along the northern route. The woman they sought was traveling with a man, possibly the same individual who'd helped her escape from the fort. That man was to be taken alive if possible, but his death wouldn't be mourned if he resisted capture. As the mercenaries rode away, Jack felt his heart hammering against his ribs. How had Reeves known about his presence? The Major's words suggested that Jack's involvement with Ayanna wasn't seen as a random act of charity but as part of some larger conspiracy. But that was impossible. Jack had never seen the woman before finding her in that isolated hut, had no connection to the Navajo Nation or its conflicts with the territorial government. Unless someone had been watching him, tracking his movements and waiting for the right moment to spring whatever trap they'd prepared. Ayanna emerged from hiding with terror written across her face. Through broken English and urgent gestures, she tried to explain something about the man they'd just seen, but Jack couldn't understand her fragmented words. What came across clearly was her fear, a bone-deep terror that suggested Reeves represented something far worse than mere capture and imprisonment. She kept repeating one word over and over, a Navajo term that Jack didn't recognize, but that seemed to carry the weight of a curse or a death sentence. The trading post offered shelter but no real safety. Reeves and his men could return at any time, and the isolated location made escape difficult if they were discovered. Jack made the decision to press on, heading for the larger settlement of Las Cruces, another 80 miles south. It would be a difficult journey with the children, but staying at Esperanza meant certain capture. As they prepared to leave, Jack searched the abandoned buildings for any supplies they could use. In the post commander's office, he found something that made his blood run cold. A wanted poster bearing Ayanna's likeness stared back at him from the desk. But the woman depicted in the crude drawing looked nothing like the starving widow he'd rescued. This was a portrait of someone regal and proud, dressed in fine clothing and jewelry that spoke of wealth and power. The text beneath the image was even more shocking. Ayanna wasn't just Chief Manolito's daughter, she was also the widow of Captain Thomas Morrison, a cavalry officer who'd been killed while negotiating a peace treaty between the Navajo Nation and the territorial government. The irony of the name struck Jack like a physical blow. Morrison, the same surname he carried, though he'd never heard of any military relatives. But there was more. According to the poster, Captain Morrison had been carrying important documents when he died. Papers that could expose a conspiracy involving high-ranking territorial officials and illegal weapons sales to hostile tribes. Ayanna was wanted not just as a political prisoner but as the key witness to a crime that could topple the territorial government and implicate powerful men in Washington. The stakes were far higher than Jack had imagined, and he was beginning to understand why professional killers like Reeves were hunting her with such determination. The revelation raised more questions than it answered. If Ayanna's husband had been murdered while carrying evidence of government corruption, who had killed him and why? How had she escaped whatever fate had been planned for her, and who had hidden her in that remote location? Most disturbing of all, was Jack's involvement in her rescue really a coincidence? Or had he been manipulated into this situation by forces he didn't understand? The wanted poster was dated 3 months earlier, suggesting that Ayanna had been missing for far longer than the few days Jack had known her. As they left Esperanza behind, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. Someone wanted Ayanna found, but they also wanted whoever rescued her to be implicated in her alleged crimes. By helping her, Jack had made himself a target, branded as either a conspirator or a fool depending on how the story was told. The thought that he might have been used as an unwitting pawn in someone else's game filled him with a cold fury that burned hotter than any winter wind. The journey to Las Cruces proved even more harrowing than their trek to Esperanza. The weather turned colder, and snow began falling again on their second day out. Jack's boots finally gave out completely, forcing him to wrap his feet in strips of hide cut from his saddle. Ayanna shared what warmth she could, but the children were suffering from the cold and the constant travel. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 3 years, developed a fever that worried Jack more than all the pursuing mercenaries combined. In this wilderness, sickness could be as deadly as bullets. On the third night, they took shelter in a cave hidden among the rocky hills that marked the border between New Mexico territory and the state of Texas. Jack built a small fire deep in the cavern, hoping the smoke would dissipate before emerging into the open air. As the children slept, Ayanna finally told him the complete truth about her circumstances, speaking in the halting English her late husband had taught her during their brief marriage. The story she revealed was one of love, betrayal, and murder that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Captain Thomas Morrison had been an idealistic young officer who genuinely believed in the possibility of peace between the Army and the Navajo Nation. His marriage to Chief Manolito's daughter had been both a political alliance and a genuine love match, something rare in the brutal world of frontier politics. But Thomas had discovered something that powerful men wanted kept secret: evidence of weapon sales to hostile Apache tribes that were being used to justify increased military spending and territorial expansion. The documents Thomas had died protecting contained shipping records, payment receipts, and correspondence that proved several territorial officials were deliberately prolonging the Indian Wars for profit. Weapons and ammunition were being sold to Apache raiders, who would then attack Navajo settlements, creating a cycle of violence that justified ever larger military budgets and land seizures. The scheme was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its human cost. Hundreds of innocent people on both sides had died to line the pockets of corrupt politicians and military contractors. Ayanna had been with her husband when he was murdered, hidden in their wagon while he met with the supposed peace negotiators who turned out to be assassins. She'd witnessed the entire transaction, heard the names of the conspirators, and seen the faces of the men who pulled the triggers. But instead of killing her immediately, the murderers had made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed that a Navajo woman, even one married to a cavalry officer, would be dismissed as an unreliable witness by any court in the territory. They'd planned to use her as a scapegoat, blaming her for her husband's death and painting him as a traitor who'd been corrupted by his savage wife. The plan had nearly worked. Ayanna had been arrested and charged with treason, but before she could be tried and executed, someone had helped her escape from Fort Defiance. She'd never seen her rescuer's face, but he'd left her with supplies and directions to the isolated hut where Jack had found her. The man had promised that help would come, that someone would find her and take her somewhere safe. For weeks, she'd waited in that freezing shelter, watching her children slowly starve while clinging to the hope that salvation would arrive. Now Jack understood why Reeves had known about his involvement. He wasn't a random Good Samaritan who'd stumbled upon a family in need. He'd been selected, guided to that location by someone who knew exactly where Ayanna was hidden. But who had arranged this elaborate rescue, and what did they want in return? The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient to be mere chance. Someone had been watching Jack, studying his movements and his character, waiting for the right moment to involve him in this deadly game. The revelation left Jack feeling manipulated and angry, but it also clarified his situation. Whoever had arranged Ayanna's rescue had chosen him because they knew he wouldn't abandon a family in need, regardless of the personal cost. That suggested they knew more about his character and his past than any stranger should. Jack began to wonder if his own troubles in Colorado and Santa Fe had been orchestrated, designed to drive him along a specific path that would lead inevitably to that isolated hut in the mountains. As dawn broke over their rocky shelter, Jack made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would take Ayanna and her children to safety, not because some unknown manipulator had arranged it, but because it was the right thing to do. The documents her husband had died protecting were still hidden somewhere, and with them, the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy that had cost so many lives. If Jack could help Ayanna recover those papers, they might finally bring justice to the men responsible for this web of corruption and murder. But first, they had to survive long enough to reach Las Cruces, and that was looking increasingly unlikely. The storm was worsening, and Jack's body was reaching the limits of its endurance. His feet were frostbitten, his hands barely functional, and the fever that had claimed Ayanna's youngest daughter was beginning to affect her son as well. Without medical attention and proper shelter, none of them would see another week. The irony wasn't lost on Jack that he might die trying to save the family he'd been manipulated into rescuing, becoming just another casualty in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. As they prepared to leave their rocky shelter, Jack spotted movement in the valley below. A line of riders was approaching from the north, too distant to identify but clearly following their trail. Reeves and his mercenaries had found them, just as Jack had feared they would. The final confrontation was approaching, and Jack knew that everything he'd learned about Ayanna's true identity and her husband's murder would die with them unless he could find a way to turn the tables on their pursuers. The game that had begun with a simple act of charity was about to reach its deadly conclusion, and Jack Morrison was no longer content to be anyone's unwitting pawn. The riders below numbered at least 20 men, far more than the dozen Jack had seen at Esperanza. Reeves had called in reinforcements, suggesting that capturing Ayanna alive was worth significant expense and effort to whoever was paying him. Jack checked his weapons one final time, knowing that his aging Colt revolver and worn Winchester rifle would be poor matches for the superior firepower of professional killers. But he'd been in desperate situations before, and sometimes courage and determination could overcome superior odds. Today, he would discover whether that faith was justified or merely the delusion of a broken-down cowboy who'd stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. Tentar novamentio Claude pod cometer eros. Confira semper as respostas.